Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Recent deployments of Guard units to cities like D.C., Los Angeles, and Memphis have raised tough questions about leadership, legality, and long-term impact. From command structure to civil-military relations, former Army Secretary and Congressman Patrick Murphy weighs in on what these missions mean for the Guard and for the country. Secretary Murphy, thank you for joining me.
Terry, it is great to be with you. Thank you so much. We served together a few years ago in the federal government, and it's just awesome to be with you. You're a great American, and thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you. I'm really delighted to have you on because I think you're an authority on the things that we want to talk about today. You served as Undersecretary and Secretary of the Army. You were elected to Congress. The first question I just want to ask you is, how is the Army today?
You know, the Army is still America's varsity team. They are ready to fight tonight. It's composed of 1.3 million members, about 1 million soldiers, 300,000 civilians. And of those 1 million soldiers, Terry, you know as well as I do, the majority of those 1 million soldiers are actually in the reserve component, the National Guard and Reserve. So tempo is still high, especially when you have the National Guard in places like LA and elsewhere. But we have hundreds of thousands of those troops deployed to over 170 countries, foreign countries. So they're doing, God's work and representing our families to make sure that we keep our families safe.
Thank you for setting that big picture. Let's drill in on the reserve components and especially the National Guard. President Trump has deployed the National Guard to cities in the country. Let's just start with kind of a general assessment of that. What are the challenges in deploying the National Guard into American cities?
Yeah, and listen, this is, fraught with politics, but let's just talk about the numbers. I teach at the Wharton Business School, and so I follow the numbers pretty closely as someone who'd served in the Appropriations Committee, et cetera, and obviously helped run the Army. But the reality of it is that when you send 4,200 National Guard troops in California to LA, et cetera, it costs between $120 and $130 million, right? So you can make the arguments, should they have been there, et cetera, posse comitatus, Insurrection Act, but the reality of it is it costs the American taxpayer money, right? Now in Portland and Chicago. But what it does is it also, and again, I'm a big believer in our military, right? As you are too. So, I know some people are like, well, they're not trained for it. Well, they're trained to do a lot of different things. So I'm not necessarily worried. They're there to provide an auxiliary support under the Posse Comitatus Act to local law enforcement. But the reality of it is it has a disproportionate effect on small businesses. I mean, it's the reality of it. 70% of those in our reserve component work for small businesses. So that has a 15 times greater impact. What does that mean? Because I invest, Terry, as you know, beside working at Helco Global, beside teaching at Wharton, I'm a venture capitalist. I've invested with my partners over $250 million to over 200 companies, majority of which, 87% of which are veteran-owned companies. But these small businesses, because of these actions, will lose about 1.9% in sales. What does that mean? That means because these reservists are leaving, their companies to go and deploy, they're some of them are in sales, some of them are, but people have to cover down and they're going to lose money. When you look at the cities themselves, when you look at D.C., I look at the stats of like Open Table, restaurants in D.C.'s up to a 31% less reservations in the restaurants in Washington, D.C. when we had, the National Guard, deployed there. Now, again, the other day I was in the Eastern Market and I saw, I was at Starbucks grabbing coffee with somebody, right? And, I saw, a squad, it was eight troops walking by. They weren't harming anybody. They were just walking. It was a beautiful day. And it is what it is. But you can't deny the fact it is a chilling effect on some citizens. They won't go out to eat. They won't do that. And so it's hurting our business owners, specifically like our restaurants, et cetera. So, we got to think about those type of things. It has, down the line effects that I don't think a lot of people think about.
That's a really important perspective. And I also want to think about when they're on the street, when National Guard folks are in a city, what are some of the operational challenges of mixing them with domestic law enforcement, chain of command, operational responsibilities? How do the folks on the ground keep it all straight?
Well, I mean, you know as well as I do, whether you're a police officer or a soldier, the worst thing that can happen is if you have to unholster your weapon, and take action and arguably up to someone's life. And so I do think some of the criticism, and again, I'm a proud Democrat, was elected Democrat, but I was an independent most of my life. Most American veterans are independents. And I say that because there's a lot of Democrats that will say, oh, they're not trained for this, or like, these aren't, yes, they're trained killers, no doubt about it, right? But so are our police officers, and they're there to protect and serve. So listen, they have different communication systems, they have different things, and so it's, different verbiage on how to talk, but they're going to work hand in glove with local law enforcement, especially as an auxiliary role, so they don't violate the Posse Comitatus Act. But I would say, logistically, as you mentioned, when you deploy them, that means they're not going home at night to their houses. That means they're not, they're deployed. So, they're going to sleep, preferably on a cot in an area that's somewhat climate controlled. They might not have showers for days. It's not an easy life for them. It's not, the life that I had to serve when it was 138 degrees in Baghdad, Iraq, an invasion in South Central Baghdad, which was a Sunni and Shia area when I was with the 82nd Airborne Division, but it's still not pleasant. And, we got to make sure that we're taking care of our troops. They're there to serve. They're answering the call that the president has asked them to do. But we can't just have Congress sitting there, which is a co-equal branch of government. They can't continue to bend the knee. They got to make sure that they're engaged in this process.
I'm speaking with Patrick Murphy, who served as an elected representative from Pennsylvania's 8th Congressional District and Undersecretary and Acting Secretary of the Army. Let's think also about the impact on these individual service members, right? They have jobs at home. They're pulled away from those jobs to do this kind of work. What happens in terms of unit morale when they're asked to do these kinds of domestic assignments?
I think for most of them, they're willing to do it, right? I mean, listen, I know, I was a professor at West Point as a young captain. I went to airborne school. I was air assault school, and I was getting ready for Ranger school. But, I was just on the faculty, and 9/11 happened. So I deployed. I wanted to go right to Afghanistan. That wasn't the case. I was sent to Bosnia instead right away. And I served under General Petraeus. And then I came back from that deployment and was re-signed with the 82nd Airborne Division. It was part of the invasion in Iraq. And, I had real questions, frankly, about the war in Iraq. I knew there was a connection to 9/11. I had studied Al-Qaeda, teaching at West Point. And, I knew, frankly, I knew what most of the world knew, that, it wasn't going to be the right maneuver, but we did it anyway. But I was a professional, and I went and did my job. I never bellyached. I never talked about it, even in dark moments in Baghdad when we lost 19 of our brothers at the time. So most of our troops are incredibly professional. They're not going to, listen, soldiers will always bitch and moan, but they're not going to, they're going to do, the best they can with the resources that they have. So I'm not overly worried about that. They're trained. You're going to still have unit cohesion, et cetera, especially if it's 30, 60 days, now if they're going for 6 months, 12 months, that's different. That means their wives back home are going to be like, hey, or spouses, I should say, spouses back home are going to, and their kids, that will be a little bit more of a grind. I will also say, for those who are active, federally, for them to be away from their employers, especially if they were making more money, they get activated on the National Guard. And if they're federalized, that means right now they're not going to, starting next week, they're not getting a paycheck, right? So I know most people say, well, they're going to get back pay. Yeah, but the last shutdown 6 years ago lasted 35 days. Imagine going over a month. Now, I am, as Terry, I'm a teach at Wharton. I have a show on Yahoo Finance called Warrior Money. I talk about Dave Ramsey and, have a budget and live below your means and stuff like that. Have an emergency 3-month, fund. But most folks don't. Most folks can't afford $500 medical bill without putting their, going to debt on it, right? So I say that if these soldiers are taken away from their families, taken away from their jobs, sent to places like Los Angeles, Portland, Chicago, right, and then not get paid, their spouse back at home when they're, they still got to pay mortgage, they still have to pay for the dance recital, they still have to pay those expenses. It's really going to be a strain. And Terry, I would, another effect that people aren't thinking about, we already, whether it's law enforcement or American veterans, they're almost 2 times as likely to take their own life by suicide. We have lost over 120,000 veterans since 9/11 to suicide, death by suicide, like 10x what we lost to combat. And I say that because one of the main reasons that people take their own life is the financial strain. And, when you are deploying these National Guard members and then not paying them at the same time, one, it's not a good look. Two, it's an incredible strain on them and their families. And I'm praying this is a short-term shutdown, et cetera. But the reality of it is that we got to make sure we do all we can to wrap our arms around them. I do like the fact that corporate America is stepping up a little bit. So you look at, USAA or PenFed, USA, happen to be a member. I'm not hawking them, I don't work for them, but, USAA have, come forward and say, hey, listen, if you're not getting paid under the shutdown, we will give you a no interest loan for what your net take home is. We'll give that to you. And so whether it's $500 to $6,000 a month, that's a great thing. And if I don't know, you have listeners that are in the National Guard and are veterans, you should do it before you need it, because when you need it and then you go apply for it, it doesn't come for 2 or 3 days, arguably, like you got to, because they do the background check and all this stuff, like you got to be proactive on it, and you got to take care of your family first, because, if your heart and your head is not in the game, you're going to get hurt.
We were talking about the impacts on communities and individuals in National Guard deployment. I want to kind of lift the level up a little bit to governors. Governors control their state National Guards. What are the legal and constitutional tensions when the federal government overrides that authority?
Yeah, well, right from the jump, we got to remember the founding of our country 250 years ago. We broke away from England. We didn't want another king. We wanted a very limited government. And a government, and again, I spent years of my life teaching constitutional law at West Point. I love our Constitution. It's the blueprint of our country. It was a righteous document. It's a living, breathing document. It's been amended 27 times in 250 years, but this is the reality. What they can never change is that only the powers enumerated, meaning spelled out in the Constitution, are given to the federal government. Everything else under the Bill of Rights, first 10 amendments of the Constitution, and also under the 10th Amendment, reverts back to the states. So when you have National Guard, they report to the governor. When the governor calls 911, he calls his or her state police or the National Guard, right? So emergencies, hurricanes, floods, et cetera, National Guard, uprisings, National Guard. When the president of the United States calls 911, if it's not the 82nd Airborne Division or Delta or Navy SEALs, et cetera, and again, it's usually active duty troops. But if he calls upon the National Guard, he usually has to do it in conjunction with the governors, and that's a tension. What I advise, and what I have advised on Fox News, on Fox Business, on Yahoo Finance, et cetera, is that there is no doubt that crime across America has gone down. It's gone down about 35% the last several years. That's a good thing, right? But there's still crime. There's still bad areas in the world, in Chicago, in Philadelphia, in Portland, et cetera. Does that mean we're going to call the National Guard in all those cities? No. But if I'm a governor, can you try and find a way to work with President Trump, and show that leadership and say, hey, listen, it doesn't mean you have to agree with everything he's doing, but he's going to say, hey, if you're going to give us National Guard and, whether you're from our state or another state, to go patrol the streets of Chicago to make it safer, can they work together? The problem is that our leaders in Washington, Terry, are talking past each other. They're not even trying to communicate. They're doing it when we talk about our National Guard in cities like Portland or Chicago or LA. They're doing it when we talk about the federal shutdown. I mean, here you have a federal shutdown. It's a continuing resolution bill, about $5.7 trillion. The Democrats, gave them the deal with no real ask last March. They haven't debated. They haven't talked about it. President Trump, and again, I'm not saying this in a partisan way, but he told the Republican leaders, I'll deal with the Democrats, the leadership. He hasn't dealt with them when it comes to offensive operations, taking out, narco boats in Venezuela, which is an offensive act, and only Congress can declare war. I digress. But when it comes to the budget, he hasn't talked to them either, and then he cancels the meeting with them, and then he meets with them. And listen, the Democrats are asking for about $30 billion to basically put back the subsidies under the Affordable Health Care Act, an act I proudly voted for, right? An act that covered tens of millions of more Americans under health insurance. The reality of it is these subsidies go for because very poor people get Medicaid. It's the lower middle class folks, the people who are making $70,000 a year. Now, if we don't increase those subsidies, Terry, come January 1st, this isn't an academic exercise. This is months away. People are going to pay $841 more a month in healthcare subsidies. Most American families can't afford $841, right? So the Democrats are saying, give us $30 billion and increase these subsidies. By the way, the majority of which go to red states, not even blue states. And they're not having these substantive, constructive conversations. And more importantly, Terry, they're not talking to the American people, both sides. They're digging their heels. They're saying, well, just do this and then we'll talk. Come on, you can walk and chew gum at the same time. And that's why there's a trust deficit in America, Terry. That's why people don't believe, whether you're Democrat or Republican, you're frustrated as hell because it's the American people that are getting squeezed right now. And the American dream for far too many is turning into the American nightmare.
Well, let's follow up on that trust deficit. I know you've done some work on it, but I'm also concerned about the impact of National Guard on the streets of cities in America, on the military-civilian collaboration and relationships. So put those two pieces together for me and talk me through how deploying the National Guard may impact the trust deficit.
Yeah, well, listen, the American military is one of the most well-respected professions in America. So the two most highly rated, most well-respected professions, according to Gallup and most of the studies out there, are the military veteran and small business owners, right? So that's number one. When you have these National Guard members that are in the streets that have to deal with certain situations that may or may not come up, and of course it's, they're going to come up, they're going to act in a certain way. They're going to protect their brothers and sisters that they're serving with. They're going to do what's necessary. They're going to follow 99.9% of the time the rules of engagement. So any hostile act or hostile intent, it's called escalation of force. They're going to follow that because they've been trained at it, like you were trained, Terry, when you were at West Point and beyond. They're going to be trained and take appropriate action. And what we call, proportional force. Someone throws a rock at them or someone mouths off to them, they're not going to shoot them, right? But at the same time, if there's shots fired, they're not going to fire warning shots. That's not how we roll in the military. We shoot to kill. We shoot center mass, and we train that we're ready to fight tonight. Now you put those American warriors, side by side with police officers in these cities, they're going to do, what's necessary. So, they're back home seeing their families again, right? And so, just like our police officers, they're going to be there to protect and serve. But when they come across bad actors that sometimes and far too often act inappropriately and act violently against those who wear the cloth of our community or the cloth of our country, bad things are going to happen. And, I just don't want to see that to degrade the American military's reputation. I worry about it. And that's why I implore political leaders to work together. If you're a governor, whether it's in a red state or a blue state, work with the president. You might not have voted for him, but he's still our president, right? And I'm not saying if you can't, you can't, but you got to continually try and not just quit because your overtures were denied a couple of times, right? And that's what I get, I think, frustrated about. I think one of the reasons why we don't see, to be honest with you, more leaders who are willing to work across the aisle, Terry, is because, we have a lack of veterans serving in Congress. It used to be 80% of the members of Congress were American veterans. Now it is 18%. So going from 4 out of every 5 to less than 1 out of every 5 is not good. And at the local level, it's not even 18%, it's 8%. I just had Atlanta City Councilman Jason Dozier on my Yahoo Finance show called Word Money, and those numbers were staggering. I didn't realize it was down to 8%. But again, what we need to do are leaders who, again, are in service to others. They're not doing it for themselves. They're not doing it for the political party. They're doing it for the people they represent. And if you're the president or a member of Congress, that's the 340 million Americans in our phenomenal country. If you're the governor of a state like Pennsylvania, that's for the 13 million people in Pennsylvania. Like, what are you doing to work where you can, with frankly, president, your people may not have voted for him. Maybe they did, right? But we got to start working together and stop the BS talking past each other.
So let's just talk one more step Beyond that, the president seems to be intent on using the National Guard in this way. So let's assume that that policy continues. Are there safeguards, protections, policies that you would want to see put in place to make sure that the Guard maintains its statutory mission or that it's used appropriately?
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, one, you have to follow current U.S. law, number one. And the current U.S. law, whether it's the Insurrection Act, whether it's the Posse Comitatus Act, these have been around for over, 100 years. And they're good pieces of legislation that make sure that we have a limited federal government, including the National Guard, but also clarity, with the American people. Like, hey, yes, we're setting the National Guard in wherever it is, but they're going to play an auxiliary role, to our police force. And they're going to play an auxiliary role, which is, again, by law, and not be, the first ones in there kicking down doors to take out the bad actors. That's what, the police are for. And my dad, who's a Navy veteran and was a police officer, he served for 22 years. My uncle served. My cousin's still on the job in Philadelphia, right? And, what we just need, especially those of us, who understand law enforcement, who understand our military, for them not to be misused by this projection of power, which frankly I think is what folks are seeing. But I would say to you, Terry, what I think the Democrats do miss is that they lost a lot of votes this past election, a year ago, the presidential race, in cities. President Trump gained a more majority of Latino voters, people who live in cities. Now, again, he didn't win a majority of them, but he got a much bigger share. And part of that, Terry, was because of the crime rates, because, he projected his power and said, and again, I didn't vote for him, but the reality of it is our leaders, whether you're a mayor in a city or you're the governor of a state, you better recognize that and work with the elected leaders in a bipartisan way. And most importantly, communicate that to the people about what is going on and what is not going on.
I've been speaking with Patrick Murphy, served as an elected representative from Pennsylvania's 8th Congressional District and Undersecretary and Acting Secretary of the Army. Thank you so much for being with me.
Terry, you're a great American. Thank you for having me on. And if people need to reach me, I'm at Patrick Murphy, PA on social media or LinkedIn, Patrick J. Murphy. God bless you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.